A man does not carry a rifle for 50 years because it is convenient. He carries it because it became part of him in a place where putting it down meant dying. That is what the rangemaster did not understand on the morning he held up a 1903 Springfield and called it a relic in front of 30 paying students and one very quiet old man standing at the back of the room. The old man did not flinch. He did not clear his throat. He simply looked at the rifle the way a father looks at a photograph of his son that a stranger is holding carelessly. And he waited. If you believe the men who fought in the mud and snow of Korea and the frozen hills of the Chosin Reservoir deserve more than a dismissive hand wave from a man who learned tactics from a YouTube playlist, type the word honor in the comments right now. Because what happened next at the Ridgeline Firearms Training Center outside Bozeman, Montana on a cold Saturday morning in March changed every person who witnessed it. His name was Walter Greer. He was 82 years old, and he had driven 4 hours from his home in Billings in a 2003 Chevy pickup with a cracked dashboard and a heater that worked only on the passenger side. He wore a dark green wool shirt buttoned to the collar and canvas work pants the color of old pine bark. His boots were brown leather lace-ups he had resoled twice in the last decade because the uppers were still good, and a man does not discard what still has life in it. On his head sat a tan cap with the words First Cavalry Division stitched in black thread above the bill, faded to the color of old straw. He had come because his granddaughter, a 24-year-old named Claire, who had just signed her enlistment papers with the United States Army, had asked him to come watch her first formal rifle clinic. She wanted him to see where she was starting. She did not yet know where he had finished. Walter had not told her. He never told anyone. That was simply not the kind of man he was. The facility was modern and well-funded, the kind of range that charged $400 a weekend and attracted men who owned expensive optics and had never once been cold enough to matter. The main building was all steel and glass with a long covered firing line that looked out over 500 yards of open Montana grassland. Steel targets hung at intervals from 50 yards to 400. A digital timer board glowed orange on a post near the instructor's position. Everything about the place said precision. Everything about the place said new. The rangemaster's name was Troy Halstead. He was 41 years old, compact and fast-moving, with the confident stride of a man who had never once walked into a room and doubted his own authority. He had served 6 years in the Army Reserve as a logistics officer and had built Ridgeline Firearms from a 2-bay outdoor range into a full training facility over the last 8 years. He was good at what he did. He was also the kind of good that had never been tested by anything that could test it back. He opened the morning session at 8 o'clock sharp. He thanked the students for coming, ran through the safety brief with practiced efficiency, and then picked up the first object lesson of the day. It was a 1903 Springfield rifle, the same pattern carried by American soldiers through 2 world wars. The wood stock was dark walnut, worn smooth at the grip. The action was a Mauser-style bolt, precise and deliberate. The barrel was 24 inches of cold-rolled steel that had once been capable of putting a bullet through a man-sized target at 600 yards in trained hands. Troy held it up with one hand, the barrel pointed at the ceiling, his expression somewhere between amusement and mild pity. "This," he said, "is a museum piece. No optic, no rail system, no detachable magazine of any consequence. Bolt action in a world of semi-auto. This rifle was state-of-the-art in 1943. In 2025, it is a wall decoration." He set it on the table with a small thud. Any of you who think old platforms have a place in modern training environments are going to have a very educational morning. Several students nodded. A few smiled. One young man near the front filmed it on his phone. At the back of the room, Walter Greer looked at the rifle on the table. His jaw moved once, very slightly. Then it stopped. He folded his hands in front of him and said nothing. Claire, standing beside him, leaned close and whispered, "Grandpa, you okay?" Walter looked at her with pale gray eyes that had seen 4 different decades of American military history and said, very quietly, "I'm fine, sweetheart. Pay attention. You might learn something today. Just maybe not what he thinks he's teaching." She didn't understand that yet. She would. The morning moved through fundamentals. Troy ran his students through modern rifle technique with genuine competence. His instruction on breathing, trigger discipline, and positional shooting was solid, and Claire absorbed it seriously, notebook open and moving. Walter watched all of it without comment. He heard things he recognized. He heard things that had been renamed and repackaged from lessons that were older than Troy Halstead's parents. He kept that to himself. At the mid-morning break, Troy set up the distance drill. Wait. 6 shots on a 12-inch steel plate at 300 yards. Modern rifles only, he said. This was the part of the morning designed to show what contemporary equipment could do. One by one, the students stepped to the line. Most of them connected 2 or 3 times out of 6. A few went 4 for 6. Claire shot her string carefully and rang the plate 4 times, clean and unhurried, and Walter watched her from behind the line with an expression that had no name but would have been recognized immediately by any man who had ever watched his own blood accomplish something hard. Troy demonstrated last. He shot 6 for 6 in under 5 seconds with a modern semi-automatic rifle wearing a high-powered optic that cost more than Walter's truck. The class applauded. Troy lowered the rifle and smiled the smile of a man who had planned this moment carefully. Then he made his mistake. He looked toward the back of the line where Walter stood with his canvas bag and his old rifle case, and he said, loudly enough for the whole class to hear, "Sir, I noticed you brought a case. You're welcome to shoot the 50-yard plate if you'd like. We've got a target set up over there that might be more appropriate for that platform." The 50-yard plate was the one they used for beginners. For people who had never fired a rifle before. It was the size of a dinner tray. Claire's head turned toward her grandfather with something close to alarm in her eyes. Walter looked at Troy for a long moment. Then he looked at the 300-yard steel. Then he looked back at Troy. "I appreciate the offer," he said. "Offer," he said. "But I'd prefer the 300 if that's all right with you." Troy's smile stayed in place. He made a small open-handed gesture toward the firing line. "Be my guest," he said. The tone was the tone of a man who has just given a child permission to attempt something the child cannot do. Walter unzipped his case. He lifted out a 1903 Springfield rifle with a leather sling worn to the color of dark honey. The stock was the same dark walnut it had always been. There was no optic on it. There was no rail. Lo, there was a set of iron sights that had last been zeroed in 1951 at Camp Drake in Japan by a 26-year-old corporal named Walter Greer, who was about to ship to Korea and wanted to make sure his rifle would do what he needed it to do. When the moment came, he had never re-zeroed it. He had never needed to. He walked to the firing line. He did not rush. He set his feet, lowered himself to one knee on the concrete pad with the careful deliberateness of a man who respects what his knees have given him over 8 decades. And he settled the rifle into his shoulder, the way a man settles into a chair he has sat in for 60 years. He wrapped the sling around his left forearm in a hasty loop, the way they had taught him in 1949 at Fort Ord, California, when a sergeant named Briggs had told him that a sling is not decoration. It is your third hand, and you will use it until the day you die. And do not let anyone tell you otherwise. He found the target in his iron sights, a 12-inch steel plate at 300 yards, barely visible against the brown Montana grassland. The range went quiet. He inhaled slowly. He exhaled half. He held. He held. The Springfield fired with a sound like a door slamming in an empty house. A long second passed. And then the steel rang at 300 yards, clean and certain, the sound arriving a half beat after the impact, the way sound always does when the distance is real. Nobody said anything. Walter cycled the bolt. The brass case spun out onto the concrete. He required. He fired again. The steel rang again. He fired 4 more times without adjusting, without pausing, without any visible change in his breathing or his expression. 6 rounds, 6 rings, each one unhurried. He lowered the rifle. He checked the chamber. He set it on the bench with the muzzle pointed downrange. Then he stood up slowly and stepped back from the line. The silence lasted a full 10 seconds. That is a very long time when 30 people are standing in the same place. It was broken by a man none of the students had noticed arrive. He had come through the side gate during the drill and stopped at the edge of the firing line without speaking. He was somewhere in his late 60s, lean and straight-backed, wearing a plain gray jacket and a Veterans of Foreign Wars cap. He had a laminated badge on a lanyard around his neck that read National Rifle Association, Distinguished Life Member. His name was Robert Cass, and he had driven up from Billings that morning because a mutual friend had sent him a text message that said simply, "Walt Greer is at Ridgeline today. Thought you'd want to know." Robert walked forward through the students who moved aside without knowing why. He stopped 3 feet from Walter and came to attention the way a soldier comes to attention when his body remembers something his mind has almost let go of. "Walt," he said. His voice was not entirely steady. Walter looked at him. A small thing moved across his face and was gone. "Bobby," he said. "Long drive." "Not long enough," Robert said. He turned to face the class, and he spoke without introduction or preamble because what he had to say did not require any. "My name is Robert Cass. I served with this man in the First Cavalry Division from 1950 to 1952, including the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir and the breakout from Hagaroo in December of 1950. Walter Greer held a ridgeline for 11 hours in temperatures that hit 30 below with 4 other men so that 800 soldiers could withdraw safely behind them. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Purple Hearts, and a commendation from his battalion commander that I have read with my own eyes and that I will not attempt to summarize because there are no adequate words in my vocabulary." He paused. He also held the 8th Army rifle record for individual marksmanship with the 1903 Springfield from 1951 until the Army retired the platform. That record was never broken. It was simply retired with the rifle. He looked at Troy Halstead. His eyes were not cruel. They were the eyes of a man delivering a verdict that is already final. "Son, I don't know what you were trying to teach this morning, but I'll tell you what you taught instead. You taught 30 people that it is possible to stand 10 feet from a legend and see nothing but an old man with an old rifle. That is not a lesson about firearms. That is a lesson about blindness." Troy Halstead did not move for a long time. He stood with his hands at his sides and his mouth slightly open, and the color leaving his face in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. Claire had both hands pressed flat against her sternum, as if trying to hold something inside her chest. The young man near the front who had been filming everything had lowered his phone and was sitting on the ground with his back against the wall and his eyes very wide. The rifle on the bench sat between all of them like a quiet witness, because the rifle was never the point. The rifle had never been the point. The man behind it was the point. The 60 years of cold mornings and careful hands and the understanding that a tool is only as true as the person who carries it. That was the point. That had always been the point. Troy found his voice eventually. He found it the hard way, which is the only way a voice like his ever gets found. He apologized to the class. He apologized to Walter by full name and rank. He apologized to Claire for what she had almost been taught to believe about the men who came before her. He did not apologize well because he had never had to do it before. But he meant every word of it, and the class could tell the difference. He asked Walter if he would be willing to speak about what accurate shooting actually required at distance with iron sights. Walter thought about it for a moment and then he said he would. And he did, standing at the firing line for 2 more hours while 30 students listened to a man who had learned marksmanship the way it was learned when getting it wrong meant something that no range drill could replicate. In the weeks after that morning, Troy Halstead removed the 1903 Springfield from the storage closet where it had been sitting as a prop and put it in a locked display case in the main classroom. He put a small placard beneath it. The placard read, "This rifle was fired 6 for 6 at 300 yards with iron sights on March 8, 2025 by Master Corporal Walter Greer, 1st Cavalry Division, United States Army, age 82. It is not a relic. It is a standard. Claire Greer shipped to basic training 6 weeks later." In her gear, wrapped in a piece of dark green wool cut from an old shirt, was a photograph of her grandfather at the firing line that morning, rifle to his shoulder, completely still, the Montana grasslands stretching out behind him. She did not tell anyone what it was. She did not need to. Walter still drives to the range on Saturday mornings when the roads are clear. He still uses the same rifle. He still wraps the sling around his left forearm in a hasty loop the way Sergeant Briggs showed him in 1949. And when a younger shooter on the next lane asks him for advice, he gives it quietly and completely and without any reference to what he has done or who he has been. Because that is not the kind of man he is. It never was. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And tell me in the comments, is there a veteran in your life who never once talked about what they did, but whose hands told the whole story if you knew how to look? Write their name below. They deserve to be remembered.